Rural Americans deserve access to the best of what our nation has to offer, especially health care. Across every state and every community, America's rural hospitals are the first line of defense, protecting our families, neighbors, and loved ones. No matter where you live, hospital care doesn't clock out. They're there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Each year, America's over 5,000 hospitals care for millions of patients, providing 24/7 emergency care, delivering babies, cancer treatments, and other life-saving care that patients rely on. Behind every one of those patients are doctors, nurses, and caregivers working tirelessly to keep people healthy and safe. Hospitals are our community's lifelines. They employ our neighbors and keep our families healthy. But now, some in Congress are threatening access to care. Tell Congress, protect patient care to keep America strong. Don't cut rural health care.
Next up, a laughing session from the Laughing Cow. Now, unpeel a wedge of the Laughing Cow light spreadable cheese, a delicious snack with 2 grams of protein and 25 calories per wedge.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Roger Stone Show. You know, I was late for Mass this morning, and my wife and daughter had already gone earlier. And Mass started at 11 o'clock, traffic a little heavier than I expected. I bolted a quadruple espresso and run for the door. And just as I was pulling up, I knew parking was going to be a problem that late. A lady in a white Tahoe backed out of a space that was closest to the side door of the church, and I made the service in the nick of time. I thanked God for my parking place. Despite the fact that I received an unconditional pardon from President Donald Trump, those on the left love to try to discredit any of my commentary by calling me a convicted felon, not recognizing that I was indeed convicted of 7 felonies in a Soviet-style show trial in Washington, D.C. What they don't tell you is that the jury forewoman who said during jury selection and during the trial that she was not familiar with me, was not familiar with the allegations against me in order to get on the jury and become the forewoman, despite the fact that she had been a Democrat candidate for Congress and was a young protege of Donna Brazile, had in fact been attacking both me and President Trump for 19 months prior to her selection as a juror on Twitter and on Instagram, but she had those on a personal setting, a private setting, so they could not be found during the due diligence. They also don't tell you that the judge in my case, Judge Amy Berman Jackson, not only limited all of my defenses, in other words, the underlying premise of the case against me was that the Russians had performed an online hack of the Democrat National Committee, had stolen data there, and that data had somehow been the subject of lies by me. It's kind of a convoluted theory. I could have produced both a forensic evidence and a true expert testimony that would demonstrate that there never was any online hack of the Democrat National Committee. The FBI admitted in my case they had never expected the servers, or was I allowed to introduce, expert testimony. So, of course, I was convicted. So it was 7 years ago yesterday that I was sentenced to almost 3 years in prison, and I thank God for answering my prayers. When I told people at the end of this ordeal that I had been redeemed in the blood of the cross and that God had answered my prayers, the Washington Monthly made fun of me for my faith, said it was yet another dirty trick. But then I don't really care what they think. I only care what he thinks. Thank you, Jesus. There's been another attempted assassination on President Trump. An assassin was killed outside Mar-a-Lago early Sunday morning. It was kind of the nightmare scenario for the Secret Service. Became a reality, and thankfully they stepped up and were able to neutralize the threat immediately. A man in his 20s, armed with what appeared to be a shotgun and fuel, had breached the secure perimeter of Mar-a-Lago, the Florida residence of President Donald Trump. Within moments, federal agents and deputies from Palm Beach County's Sheriff's Office confronted the intruder. Shots were fired. The suspect was immediately killed. No law enforcement personnel were injured. No practices were present. That's exactly why we expect the Secret Service to do. After 2 assassination attempts in 2024, one that wounded Trump in Pennsylvania, of course, Butler, which changed the face of American politics and perhaps the future of America forever, and another foiled at Donald Trump's posh West Palm Beach International Golf Club. Hesitation in these cases is not, in my opinion, an option. Sections matter. Lives depend on it. Otherwise, the alternative is a dead president or innocent bystander. Security exists to stop violence before it starts, not after bodies fail. Kudos now, in this case, to the Secret Service. This incident underscores the harsh reality, though, about political violence in America today. It's no longer theoretical. It's all too real, and it's coming from the left. The Democrat Party, the deep state, fake news, pump the masses full of insane, deranged, hateful rhetoric about President Donald Trump and his supporters, calling us racist, which we are not, calling us bigots, which we are not, calling us Nazis, which we are not, calling us every name in the book, causing this epidemic of Trump derangement syndrome. They have deliberately created the basis for these crazy far-left extremists to go out and commit acts of violence against President Trump and supporters. This is really, sadly, becoming the new normal in America. And law-abiding citizens with decent moral character, who love their constitutional freedoms, who believe in Christ, the salt and light of this great nation, better be ready to confront these kinds of threats. It shows you what kind of a sick society we live in. The man in question, Austin Tucker Martin, 21 years old, was from Carthage, North Carolina. He was first reported missing by his family on February 21st. His aunt, Chrissy Fields, posted at Facebook that his disappearance was out of character and that local police and the FBI had been contacted. This young man was driving a 2013 silver Volkswagen. It was described as 6 feet tall. Prior to the incident, Martin had no known criminal record or direct ties to known extremist groups, and his motive remains under investigation. Authorities are examining the psychological states and movements leading up to the breach. This armed man was shot and killed early Sunday morning, as I said, after breaching the secure perimeter of Mar-a-Lago, the president's Florida estate. The incident occurred around 1:30 a.m. in the north gate of the property. The man reportedly missing his family days early. Law enforcement say as Martin entered the property while another vehicle was exiting, that's how he must have slipped in the gate. He was confronted by 2 Secret Service agents and a Palm Beach County Sheriff's deputy. According to Sheriff Rick Bradshaw, Martin dropped the fuel but raised the shotgun towards officers, prompting them to open fire and neutralize the threat. So they were menaced. No law enforcement personnel were injured. President Trump was not present this weekend. If this would-be killer could read the internet, he would probably know that. But during the incident, he and First Lady Melania Trump were safely, thank God, at the White House. The FBI is now leading the investigation with support from the Secret Service, and they've requested residents submit any other relevant security camera detail. The media will tell you very little about this, by the way. They will underscore this story extraordinarily. I hear my friends in the North hit very hard with record rain, cold, and rainstorms. Apparently, Mayor Ayatollah has no time for New York City's blizzard. I read that he's attending a Hamas rally today. Tomorrow will fare no better for Gotham. Monday, he's scheduled for a Freeze the Rent symposium at noon, then an anti-ICE rally at 3 p.m., followed by a birthday party for radical Islamist hater Linda Sarsour at 6 p.m. I wonder if the dress is for that. The work of the people will have to wait until Tuesday, except for then the mayor is scheduled to fly out to Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic. That's the Tony end of the island, early Tuesday morning for the annual World Anti-Zionist Delegation, where he'll smile for the cameras and pretend to care about New York City, who's struggling with a record snowstorm. Don't even get me started about his next day. So how many people will potentially die in this blizzard because he has no love for his fellow man? This is a dereliction of duty, but then what do you expect from a limousine socialist? That's what I now call them, a limousine socialist. More bad news for Steve Bannon. I'll be talking about this later with Dinesh D'Souza, who will join me right here in the Roger Stone Show. But it turns out, according to emails released by the Department of Justice, Epstein's team booked Steve Bannon, the former disgraced Trump advisor, a Delta flight from JFK to the U.S. Virgin Islands on May 4th, 2019, with Epstein personally instructing the staff by email, Steve will stay on the island. This was 2 months before Epstein's arrest. A former chief strategist flying to the private island of a convicted sex offender on his own dime, with accommodation by Epstein himself. I would say that Bannon has even more explaining to do. I give Mario Nawfal was the journalist, online journalist who pointed that tidbit out. Also joining me later, an investigative journalist that I have admired for a very long time, Lara Logan, who is formerly, of course, the chief foreign correspondent for CBS News, one-time full-time correspondent for 60 Minutes, has covered both Afghanistan and Iraq, war coverage, has earned almost every journalistic award you can think of, the DuPont Columbia University Silver Baton, the Overseers Press Club, Emmys, of course, an Edward R. Murrow Award. But she's a Christian. She is fiercely honest. She covers topics that others will not cover. She also will join us today on the Roger Stone Show. And coming up, David Schoen, former impeachment lawyer, literally the single smartest guy I know when it comes to the law. He's going to tell us about these trade decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court and some other pertinent legal issues. So we've got the head legal beagle joining us on the Roger Stone Show. It's going to be a jam-packed show, so I'm glad you're with us. We are, of course, here for 2 hours talking history, politics, news, style, fashion. Who knows? We might even talk about food before it's all over. Thanks for joining us on the Roger Stone Show. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Well, they threw everything they had at Donald Trump, and, well, he's still standing. I think America is the better for it. The courts, the donor class, and foreign interests lined up to kill his very beneficial tariff program, and by the time the Supreme Court ruling hit the wire, Trump had already outmaneuvered all of them. Really, no president in modern history has fought harder for working Americans than Donald Trump, and no ruling from any court is ever going to change that. The Supreme Court handed down its 6-3 ruling in the Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump case yesterday, striking down his IEEPA tariff authority and delivering the legal victory that he says, and I believe, foreign interests spent a year buying lawyers and lobbyists to get. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that the law's text cannot bear much weight, quote unquote. Trump walked to the White House podium, called the decision, quote, ridiculously incorrect, told reporters that he was deeply disappointed and ashamed of the justices who lacked the courage to rule correctly, and signed a new executive order before the press finished writing the leads of their stories. Any other president holds a somber press conference, promises to respect the court's decisions, and moves on. Trump absorbed the ruling, exposed its absurdity for the record, and then turned around and signed a 10% global tariff under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, while launching Section 301 investigations that carry decades of legal precedent. The court took away the tool, so he picked up 3 others, and it was all before lunch. Clearly, the president and his White House advisors were well prepared for this moment. Those are the White House advisors who are constantly criticized, the ones who helped the president prepare. The people who funded the lawsuits that produced today's rulings are no ordinary American businesses worried about import costs. Trump correctly identified them plainly. Sleaze bags, major sleeve bags, foreign country centric. These are the same interests that spent $30 million telling factory workers in Georgia, Michigan, and Ohio that losing their jobs to China and Mexico was just the price of progress. Trump was the first president to tell them that those guys were wrong, charge their foreign competitors for access to American markets, and actually mean it. The results are documented. The Dow crossed 50,000 this week. The S&P broke 7,000. Fentanyl crossings across the border is down more than 30%. The steel plant owner Trump visited in Georgia Thursday told them factories are all up and down the highway while we were weeks from bankruptcy before the tariffs hit. Now they are all running double shifts. Jobs are coming back to America. Sir, I want to kiss you, the man told him. This is not a talking point. That is a business owner who thought was finished telling the president, who saved him exactly what he thinks. The institutional resistance of the establishment to Trump has been relentless, and it has failed every time. They've tried to bankrupt him. They tried to keep him off the ballot. They tried to put him in jail. And they tried to kill him at least twice, and you could say, with today's horrific news of the man killed at Mar-a-Lago, a third time. Trump pointed it out from the beginning. A president can embargo a foreign nation entirely and destroy its trade access to the United States, but it cannot charge that same nation $1 in tariffs. Trump, I was quoted as saying, I'm allowed to destroy a country, said, but I can't charge them a little fee. 6 justices actually signed their name to that ridiculous logic. Trump did hail Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh, who refused to go along. Kavanaugh's dissent did something beyond registering disagreement. He told Trump exactly where to go next, writing that the decision might not sustainably constrain a president's ability to order tariffs going forward, because Congress authorized that authority through multiple other statutes. Trump actually quoted Kavanaugh from the podium. So the man took a serious blow from the court, but he comes back for more. That's the Donald J. Trump that I have known for 51 years. Listening to The Roger Stone Show right here on the Red Apple Audio Networks, and we'll be right back with David Schoen, literally smartest lawyer I know.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show, entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Roger Stone Show. Joining me now is David Schoen. David Schoen very ably represented President Donald Trump in the first of his impeachment trials. David Schoen is a noted civil rights, ballot access, and criminal defense attorney, although he handles complicated civil and criminal matters before both trial and appellate courts. He's also literally the smartest lawyer I know, because David Schoen is one of the very, very few lawyers who understands that everything happens impacting a given little case doesn't necessarily happen in the courtroom or in the documents in this case, and that the exterior factors, such as publicity and media coverage, affect a trial. Many lawyers don't recognize that. David, I want to get your takeaway off the top on the Supreme Court decision, which which killed the tariff program under which President Donald Trump has brought more than $158 billion into America. What does it mean, and where do we go from here?
Thanks very much for having me on. Look, I happen to think the decision is wrong. I happen to think the dissenters have the better arguments here, but it is the decision. I don't happen to think it's going to create any kind of catastrophe. I think that any and all tariffs will be replaced under several other legislative provisions, if the president so desires. And putting aside all of the political questions, whether tariffs are advisable or not, we have now an extraordinary economy. All of the horrors that were predicted by the commentators from tariffs haven't come true. We have a stock market at record levels. And interestingly, the stock market didn't react radically to this decision that just came down. So let me just give you in a nutshell. I'm sure, I know you know, Roger, but maybe some of the listeners don't. This is a particular statutory regimen that the president decided to impose tariffs under, called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA. And it authorizes the president to take action when there's an international emergency. In this case, the president said that we have an emergency for illegal drugs coming into the country from Canada, Mexico, and China, and we have large and persistent trade deficits. And he elaborated on those things. Therefore, he believed that he had the authority to impose tariffs. I also believe that he did under this statute, but the court has said no. So let me just say where we go from here. The president immediately put out a statement imposing tariffs under other authority, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, and so on. But I think the overall story here is that tariffs will be permitted under any one or all of four separate acts. And I'll give them to you in a nutshell. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 allows the president to impose tariffs up to 50% for 150 days. After that, Congress has to pass on it. Section 232, Trade Expansion Act of 1962. The president can pick out sectors to impose tariffs on, and he has done that. Cars, car parts, heavy equipment, that sort of thing. Those tariffs remain in effect, and they will remain in effect. Under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, U.S. Trade Representatives can investigate and take action against unfair foreign trade practices. That will happen. And Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 gives the president the authority to raise tariffs up to 50% of a product's value after the U.S. International Trade Commission takes a look at it. I think Section 301 provides the most ripe area, but I think it's going to have no practical impact. The one remaining question, though, it seems to me, is one that was raised by Justice Kavanaugh in dissent. That's an important question. That is, if these tariffs were imposed without authority, is the consequence that they have to be repaid? I think the answer to that, first of all, it's going to be litigated, but secondly, has to be resoundingly no. Remember, these countries that had tariffs imposed passed along those costs to their citizens, their countries, and so on. We can't unravel all of that. The tariffs were engaged in with the belief that there was authority for them. Contracts were made accordingly, and I think it's absolute, for a number of reasons, absolutely cannot be undone with refunds given. That's it. That's all I have to say about it, I think.
I want to shift gears on you a little bit. The president, on his way to the greatest comeback in American political history, was the target of unprecedented lawfare in both federally, in New York State. We now know the extra-constitutional actions of Jack Smith. But in New York State particularly, the case I still find that they're all outrageous. The case, the values case in which Mar-a-Lago was valued at $18 million, a case with no jury but a hateful, biased judge, which was overturned, and now that's on appeal. The E. Jean Carroll case, that was dreamed up by the lawyer George Conway. They actually went and changed New York state law. They got the Democrats in Albany to change New York state law to extend the statute of limitations for certain sex-alleged crimes in order to try to set Donald Trump up with a highly credible woman, E. Jean Carroll. Trump denies having sexually assaulted her. In fact, he denies having ever met her. She says that's defamatory, and she wins a massive judgment. Little did they know, by the way, when they passed that law, that they would also capture former Governor Andrew Cuomo and Mayor Eric Adams in similar sex assault-related lawsuits. And then, of course, there's the Alvin Bragg case, the so-called hush money case. David, how are these are all on appeal. How are all of these cases, how will they be resolved? How are they going?
A very good question. I'm glad you asked, because I've been, as most Americans, I think, very disturbed by these cases since they were initiated. Let me start with the last one you mentioned, case in front of this Judge Merchant, who I've been in front of before. I found to be someone completely unsuited to be a judge, in my view, both in temperament and wisdom. I don't think he knows the law. I don't think he properly researches it. And I don't think he's fair, because he had a political agenda. In this case, we know that his daughter, the major fundraiser for Democratic candidates, he should have recused himself. And the lawyers in the case should have pursued the recusal issue much more sharply and on additional grounds, including a ground that this judge was handpicked by the chief administrative judge, we believe, with the influence of the district attorney's office. And there's a line of case law in which there was a long-standing practice in that court of the district attorney handpicking judges that a federal court has said, if it were raised directly from the trial court and on appeal, could well be subject to being overturned. I don't believe that issue was properly raised. But anyway, here's the status of the case. One of the arguments they're making is that this case should have been brought in federal court and must now be transferred to federal court, because based on the immunity decision, evidence that transpired or allegedly transpired while President Trump was president was put before the grand jury and alluded to at trial. Therefore, he should have immunity. The case should go to federal court. That argument is pending before Judge Alvin Hellerstein in the Southern District of New York. He has rejected once before sending the case to federal court. But as you know, the president was convicted on 34 counts, none of which, in my view, should have been convictions.
This is the so-called hush money. This is the so-called hush money case.
That's right. That's the hush money case. And with all due respect to the lawyers, this isn't Monday morning quarterbacking, because I said this at the time of the case. I made a number of mistakes, but those mistakes included the absolutely failure to properly use Robert Costello in the case. Costello appeared as a well-known lawyer, former deputy chief of the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office, Southern District of New York, and at one point he represented Michael Cohen, the president's former confidant. When he represented Cohen, Cohen said clearly that the president did not know anything about what was going on here, that he, Michael Cohen, handled everything with this Stormy Daniels and so on. And he did so at a time when he had every incentive to implicate the president in making a deal for himself in the Southern District of New York. These lawyers absolutely blew it, the defense lawyers, when it came to using Robert Costello. They made a farce out of it. They never told him that the judge had limited what he could testify to. So he went into areas that had already been ruled off limits, and they never rescued him from it. So that was a terrible mistake. But the bottom line of the case is it has to be reversed, whichever court hears it, not just on the immunity grounds, but the primary issue is, this is a case in which, remember, it only became a felony by showing that he committed the misdemeanor of doctoring records for the purpose of committing another crime. The jury in that case was never instructed on what other crime they had to consider. They never returned a finding of what other crime it is they claim he doctored the books to commit. Absolutely has to be reversed. I'll go next to the Trump organization case, in which the fine imposed rose to a level of $600+ million and so on. Completely outrageous from the start. In this case, as you noted, has been reversed by the appellate division in the New York State system. It was reversed because they said the damages were excessive. I thought there was another primary issue should have been raised in the case. First of all, it should have led to a jury trial. There was no jury trial in the case because the prosecution was based on what's known as Executive Law 6312 in New York State. That's an equitable remedy as opposed to a legal remedy. An equitable remedy means the court can impose requirements of conduct on the party being sued. And that, for example, Letitia James brought this case against the Trump Organization. If she were to prevail, then equitable relief would be declaring how they can do business, whether they can do business. But in this case, they imposed damages of $500 million or so. The only cases that have said you don't get a jury trial in this case says you don't get a jury trial because it's equitable relief, not damages. If it's damages relief, you must have a jury trial. This was clearly tail wagging the dog. In this case, damages was the overriding factor in the case, extraordinary damages. I'm worried about this case for one reason, additional reason. There's a case coming through the federal court system now in which the United States just granted certiorari. It's called SWIFT. In that case, it's a very similar issue. There's a federal statute at issue. It calls for the disgorgement of ill-gotten gains. And like in this case, 6312 that the president was prosecuted under, disgorgement could be a remedy if you find that there was a victim and harm done. In the president's case, the banks testified they were happy as a pig in mud to get his loans. They made money off of the loans. There was no loss, no harm, no victims. In the federal case coming up, same thing. No harm, no loss, no victims, but they've allowed a fine to be imposed, disgorgement. The Solicitor General has taken the position in that case that the government agreed certiorari should be granted, but that the statute should be upheld to allow disgorgement when there are no victims, no loss, and no harm. I'm afraid that's going to come back to bite them in the Trump case, and I would urge them in the strongest terms possible to rethink their position in the federal case and be consistent with the state court case and say where, like in the Trump case, there's no victim, no loss, no damages, no harm. You cannot impose a fine, excessive or otherwise.
We're talking to lawyer David Schoen. When we come back, I'm going to ask him about the E. Jean Carroll case, the part of the cavalcade of lawfare against President Donald Trump in New York State before his triumphant return to the White House. Those cases, unfortunately, don't just go away. One of them he has won on and is now on appeal by the government. The other two are still on appeal. But I want to ask David Schoen lastly about the E. Jean Carroll case, and then I want to talk to him about some other issues. We're talking to David Schoen. We've only got a limited amount of time. Literally the smartest lawyer I know, truly brilliant, not a Republican, not necessarily a conservative, but a strong supporter of the state of Israel, and someone who's fought long and hard against Islamic terrorism, as well as a civil rights lawyer who has represented minor parties and others with important issues of ballot access, which is thankless but important work. We'll be right back with David Schoen.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
We're talking to noted attorney David Schoen. David, I was going to ask you about the E. Jean Carroll case, but I think I'm going to save that for another day because there's a much more important case. You have advocated for a pardon for two New Yorkers currently incarcerated, both of them in very poor health, both in their 90s, Michael Sessa and Vic Orena. You've advocated a pardon, but your argument why these men were convicted of a crime, a murder, in fact, that the government not only knew that they didn't commit, but knew was a murder that had been blessed by corrupt prosecutor Andrew Weissman. Tell us about this case.
It's the best example of corruption in the Department of Justice in the history of the department. I've said that many times. It's absolutely true. The case involved a corrupt FBI agent named Linda Vecchio who was working with a faction of a mafia family. He was finally caught when another agent heard him slam his fist down on the desk after a murder and said, "Yes, we're going to win this thing." They employed the underboss of a mafia family to commit murders and to be an informant and so on. They withheld evidence, but the central part of this case is most important, is it was prosecuted by Andrew Weissman. Andrew Weissman ought to be known by many of your listeners as the person who was Mueller's right-hand man, never should have been on that commission, the so-called investigating President Trump. In the Eastern District of New York, well-known lawyer Jerry Shargell referred to him as the pathological liar after the Saturday Night Live figure. These two men have served over 33 years in prison. After their conviction in other related prosecutions, the evidence that Weissman had withheld was put before the jury, and 48 different jurors heard it, and 4 different trials, and issued acquittals in those cases. These two have never gotten a fair hearing. They both deserve to be pardoned. As you say, Vic Arena is in his 90s. Michael Sess is in his late 60s. Their lives have been lost, but now they must be returned to their families. And it sends an important message about stamping out corruption in the Department of Justice and exactly what Andrew Weissman is and what he did in this case. He didn't act alone, but he was a primary actor. And when he was called on it by another prosecutor on the team, he said, we have no obligation to turn over this evidence of corruption. We now have a confidential informant, top echelon confidential informant, who came forward and said he was given license to commit 12 murders by this prosecution team, by the agent, with the knowledge of the prosecutor. It's absolutely outrageous. They had to change the guidelines in the Department of Justice for how informants are used after this case was heard. So I'm hoping that the president will give clemency to these two, at least release them from prison. They should be pardoned, but in any event, release them from prison forever.
Commutation would certainly be fair. Look, this is a textbook for Andrew Weissman. He is the lawyer who destroyed a major corporation and their accountant. He was the architect of the Russia collusion hoax. Andrew Weissman knew back when he was the general counsel to the FBI that the Steele dossier was a contrivance, that it was a fabrication, originally paid for, I believe, by Paul Singer, a supporter of Marco Rubio, and then resold by GPS Fusion to Hillary Clinton's campaign. So the predicate for the Mueller investigation, the predicate for the FISA warrants, FBI Director James Comey didn't have a, quote, rich mosaic of evidence. They relied solely on the totally fugazi Steele dossier, which was a report that claimed that Trump had dallied with prostitutes in Moscow when visiting as a private businessman, completely bogus, and the false claim that the Democrat National Committee had been the target of an online hack. David Schoen has been an active commentator. You can see him on Fox, you can see him on CNN, always in the mix, and literally a man who sees the law but sees it within the context of mass media today. David, many thanks. We'll be right back. We'll be right back to the Roger Stone Show. Whatever you do, please don't go away.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Roger Stone Show. Joining me now is an award-winning investigative journalist that I have admired for many years. She's had a stellar career, almost 2 decades of full-time service as the correspondent for 60 Minutes, also the chief foreign correspondent for CBS News. Today, she has a great show going rogue on all platforms. This is must-watch television. I recommend it to you highly. She's also a Christian. She is very smart and has gone into the most important issues of the day. The place I want to start, because I think she and I are both outraged, is by Susan Rice, the former National Security Advisor. She was present in the room in August 2016 when the Russian collusion plot, for which I believe she should be prosecuted, was hatched. She is all over media today, threatening Trump supporters and anyone who doesn't see things her way. Let's listen to Susan Rice.
But when it comes to the elites, the corporate interests, the law firms, the universities, the media, I agree with you, Preet. It is not. It's not going to end well for them. For those that decided that it was, that they would act in their perceived very narrow self-interest, which I would underscore is very short-term self-interest, and, take a knee to Trump. I think they're now starting to realize, wait a minute, this is not popular. Trump is not popular. What he is doing, whether on the economy and affordability or on immigration now, is not popular. And that there is likely to be a swing in the other direction. And they are going to be caught with more than their pants down. They're going to be held accountable by those who come in opposition to Trump and win at the ballot box. And I can tell you, Preet, as I talk to leaders in Washington, leaders in our party, leaders in the states, if these corporations think that the Democrats, when they come back in power, are going to, play by the old rules, and say, oh, never mind, we'll forgive you for all the people you fired, all the policies and principles you've violated, all, the laws you've skirted. I think they've got another thing coming because, just like when Trump thought, okay, I'll redistrict and the Democrats won't have the guts to play hardball. They're going to be surprised. Democrats have had a bellyful, and we're not going to play by, the old set of rules when these guys are playing by a very different set of rules. We're going to play by the law, but we're not going to violate the law the way they do, but we're not going to be suckers. And so I think, whether you're a law firm, whether you're a university, whether you're a media entity, whether you're a big corporation, whether you're big tech, you need to play a long game, not this short game that has been so detrimental. There will be an accountability agenda. Companies already are starting to hear.
I think we've got the gist of it. Lara, Logan, is that a threat?
Oh, that's most definitely a threat. And I would say there's grounds for investigating that as a terroristic threat, because a terroristic threat is broadly defined as something that terrorizes people. And I would say that, as for anyone that she defines as in opposition to the Democrats, right? She says that anyone who's in opposition to the Democrats, they end up playing the short game, taking a knee to Trump. They need to know that this is not going to end well for them. I mean, that is most certainly a threat.
Yeah, it's really quite extraordinary. And of course, for them to say, well, we're not going to be Mr. Nice Guy when we get in power. I can tell you, General Flynn can tell you, President Donald Trump can tell you, the law doesn't matter. They're the ones who violate the law. They're the ones who launched lawfare. They're the ones who weaponized our Justice Department. And now when anyone talks about accountability and justice, in the cases of those who violated the Constitution and the law and their maniacal effort to get Donald Trump to keep him off the ballot, to put him in jail, to strip him of all of his wealth, and I think at least now, sadly, 3 instances to kill him. They try to convince us that this is about revenge and retaliation, when in fact it's about accountability and justice, and these people don't want to be held accountable. Hillary Clinton this week in a BBC interview saying she has no links to Epstein. Epstein was the Clinton White House 17 times. Her husband was on his plane a few times for his charity work, a few as in 27. No mention of the fact that Jeffrey Epstein provided the seed capital for the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative. No mention of his political contributions to them. No mention of the Clinton Foundation financing the Mar Foundation run by Ghislaine Maxwell, on paper an environmental nonprofit, but in fact a pool of grooming intern potential targets for Jeffrey Epstein. No mention of all of that.
Well, Roger, it's interesting that you brought up Hillary and Susan, because there's a pattern in what they're doing. First of all, they're both on the attack, and they're not the only ones, right? Obama's been doing the same thing. So that tells me, when I look at it sort of, strategically, and I try to analyze it and figure out what's going on here, That tells me that the strategy they've come up with is that attack is the best form of defense. We all know that they're vulnerable right now with the fact that the Trump administration is in power, with so much of the information that's come out. As these documents are being released, not just on the Epstein files, but, if you look at Tulsi Gabbard and what the DNI's office has been investigating, you look at what is being exposed of what they knew and what they said under oath, versus what they said in the public, they're all in trouble. And then there's the case down in Florida that people aren't making a lot of noise about, but it's where Bannon has been subpoenaed, and there's, some dozens of people that have been subpoenaed with him, including the likes of, Comey and co, right? Where he's in serious trouble. He's been trying to get that moved out of the jurisdiction of the judge, Eileen Connor, because she's the one who threw the Trump document case out of court, and they don't feel like they're going to have a good chance with her because she's been bold enough to rule honestly and not worry about the consequences, unlike some members of the Supreme Court. So what you're describing, though, is a tactic in information warfare that's called projection. And it's when you project onto your enemy or your adversary the exactly what you are guilty of. And we've seen this from the very beginning, because who was cooperating and coordinating and conspiring with foreign governments in order to steal an American election? It was the Democrats and the Hillary campaign and the Obamas and the Brennans and the Comeys and all of these people, right? Stephen Halper, Christopher Steele, these are all foreign spies. And Alistair Downer, the ambassador, former Australian ambassador. These are people who were conspiring. They were running a cell out of Cambridge University. They would host events and conferences which would give cover to American spies. Gina Haspel was head of the CIA in London at the time. She was involved in this. And so these people who literally committed treason are the ones who then accused Trump of being elected because he's working with foreign governments, right? And it's the same thing with
Zelensky.
The Ukraine impeachment trial, same thing,
yes.
Right?
Yes, absolutely. The Ukrainian impeachment is both a defensive but also an offensive move, because Joe Biden is the one who threatened to withhold $1 billion from Ukrainian President Zelensky unless he fired the prosecutor digging into his son's business dealings at Burisma.
Correct.
So in order to cover that up, the cute twin Vindman brothers, one of them now a congressman, the other one launching a campaign for the U.S. Senate in Florida, where I suspect you'll be confronted with these questions, make up the idea that they overheard a conversation. They tell a third party, Eric Ciamella, former and future CIA guy, then working for Adam Schiff. He becomes a whistleblower. The whole thing's a fraud. It's a fugazi.
All of it.
Yep, every bit
all of it is a fraud, and they do it over and over and over again. So then, when they weaponize the government against its citizens, not just with January 6th, but with the targeting of parents as domestic terrorists and so on. And what do? They say, okay, we're going to come after you. When Trump says we're going to end the weaponization of the government, they say, oh no, this is retribution, right? He's weaponizing the government against the citizens. They do this over and over again. And the other thing they are doing right now is, in the absence of any kind of reality on their side, there's so much evidence stacked against them at this point, they're just going to create their own reality. Like the Epstein files demonstrate without any shadow of a doubt that the Clintons had a long-term, intimate relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, right? I mean, he didn't have, pictures of any other presidents, paintings of them in his house. So now Hillary's going to go out and she's going to say whatever she wants. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. And she did the same thing with the email situation. She went out there saying, I didn't have anything classified on my email. I didn't do anything wrong. She knew that was a lie. Just the fact that she only had one email server was proof that she had broken the law. Because under the law, if you're in the government, you have a classified and an unclassified system, and those are two separate servers. So if she only had one server, just housing those things on one server was a violation of the law. And she knew all of this. She lied about everything, and she got away with it. So that's been an effective tactic for her. Now Susan Rice is doing the same thing. She's saying in there that Trump is more unpopular than ever. That's not true. And she says it's because of the economy, and people don't like what he's doing. No, the only thing Trump supporters do not like right now is that he hasn't held anybody accountable. That's what they don't like, because they all know this isn't about vengeance. This is about people like Susan Rice, who were guilty of treason and sedition in 2016, and they've been doing it ever since, and they're still doing it now, and they're getting away with it. And people are sick to death of that and all the other things that the crimes that have been committed against children, against the American people, and so on. They're sick to death of the fact that there's no accountability. I'm now calling this the no accountability nation.
I hear you. I completely agree. It's an important element, by the way, to the 2026 elections. The people who voted Donald Trump Donald Trump were promised accountability and justice, and we want to see it for him and his family and so many of the victims of the Democrats' lawfare machine. When we come back, I want to ask you about events in Iran because of your experience as a longtime respected foreign correspondent. We're talking to Lara Logan. Don't fail to miss her show, Going Rogue. You can find it on all platforms. That's Lara Logan. We'll be back with her in just a moment.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back with veteran investigative journalist Lara Logan. You can follow her on X at Lara Logan. Lara, given your extensive experience as a foreign correspondent, I'd like your views on the current situation in Iran, where the regime seems to be teetering, but no lack of brutality in their tactics to try to stay in power.
Well, Roger, I'll tell you what I said from the very first moment that this began. We've been through this a number of times in our lifetimes, and we've seen what the Iranian regime does. It murders its way out of every uprising. And so this one is no exception, except the scale of it seems to be much worse. Now, it's really frustrating that, there's no foreign media on the ground in Iran. There's reports from the ground from citizen journalists or protesters or, a lot of sympathizers. And it's very difficult to establish exactly what is true. But the regime has at least, conceded at this point that they have a high body count. And there's, they've been sometimes executing hundreds of people in a day. Right. So there's no question that whether you're talking about 20,000, 40,000, or by some accounts more than 90,000 dead, that this is a regime who has no regard for the rights of any of its people. So I find it quite sickening that the Trump administration has got people sitting down to negotiate with them, because for just, as a human being, I feel like while it's difficult to work through the propaganda on both sides, at the same time, how many bodies does it take for people, for governments of the world and nations of the world to stand up and say, we're not talking to these people while they're doing this. I mean, this is an illegitimate regime, and, I'm not falling into the trap of, supporting this one or that one or saying, who should lead Iran. It's obvious at this point that the Iranian regime, not only has it been the number one state sponsor of terrorism worldwide, and been responsible for the deaths of countless Muslim people, not just in its own country, but, in places like Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and so on and so on. I mean, not only that, but this regime has proved that it has nefarious intent. And so, I know what is frustrating for me is that it's very easy for people to say Trump is supposed to be the president of peace. And if he's not doing peace and he's doing anything that's not regarded as peace, then he's betraying his base and so on. There's a lot of libertarians who jump on everything and say, oh, no airstrikes, no this, no that, because we believe in peace. Well, how do you think the Second World War was won? It wasn't won in diplomacy, right? It wasn't won on the battlefield of peace. It was won on the battlefield of war and pain and suffering and death and sacrifice. And so it's frustrating because it's another trap that's been created to say if you're a supporter of peace, now you cannot step up anywhere. You cannot be.
And that is, I agree with you. And that's not really the Trump doctrine. What Trump has done here is to view as American power, project America in a very limited way, without committing us to long land wars and American casualties and billions in spending.
Right.
He's projected American power in Iran to try to set back their nuclear weapons development program. Hopefully successfully did so. He used American power in Venezuela in a limited way. That's not what the neocons wanted. That's not what makes Lindsey Graham happy. So Trump has demonstrated he's not afraid to use power, and at a certain point, I do think his patience with the regime in Iran will run out. But the regime uses the potential return of the Shah's son, who's probably is equally as unpopular, and for whom there is little report, as a PR tool, which is really a tragedy. The answer to a theocracy is not another monarchy. Thank you, Lara Logan, Western journalist, someone I admire very much, for joining us on The Roger Stone Show.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dinesh D'Souza. Dinesh D'Souza is one of the most influential and prominent writers, scholars, thinkers, public intellectuals, an award-winning author, filmmaker, host of a new weekly show. Dinesh he's also, I think, proudly the father-in-law of Texas Congressman Brandon Gill. His daughter Danielle D'Souza Gill, a lovely young lady, is married to this future president. So, Dinesh, welcome to the Roger Stone Show.
Roger, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I've been watching you talking online, and you are as shocked as many, perhaps not me so much, but by the revelations regarding Steve Bannon. Now, my problem with Steve Bannon, I've been very, very clear, began when he testified under oath before the House Intelligence Committee, as I did, and correctly said that neither he nor I had ever discussed WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, or the emails the Democrats claimed had been stolen. Then, to my shock, who shows up as a surprise witness at my trial in New York, dressed kind of like a fat Johnny Cash, all in black with a lot of dandruff, but shows up as a mother witness and says the direct opposite, essentially perjuring himself on the stand. Even George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley noted the inconsistencies, telling the New York Post that Bannon, had two diametrically opposed sworn statements. So I then saw him go to Jeffrey Epstein's home, as reported in the New York Post in 2018, and I knew there was bad news afoot. What do you make of all these revelations now from these DOJ emails and photos, Dinesh?
Well, Roger, I'll start by saying that I think in some ways we're in a little bit of a similar position, because ordinarily we would see something in the news, we would see something in the public domain, and we'd be trying to make sense of it. But in this case, both you and I, in very different ways, have had some direct experience, with the subject, in this case, Steve Bannon. In my case, it goes back really about 12 years. I was just moving into the domain of documentary filmmaking. And of course, I was new. I didn't know the ropes. Somebody said, you should talk to this guy, Steve Bannon. And so I sat down with Bannon, who was sort of reputed to be a filmmaker. And basically, Bannon offered me the following deal. He said, okay, Dinesh, here's how it goes. You need to raise the money, $2.5 million. You need to go to Hawaii and Indonesia and Kenya, which is where I plan to go, following the Obama trail. You need to get the Obama story. You need to make the film about Obama, and then you need to sign over the rights to me. And I was like, I go, how does that work? He goes, well, we'll kind of pay you for your work in making the film, but essentially I will then own the film. And so think about this, Roger, as I look back on this now, we're talking about a film that took in something like $40 million. And essentially Bannon's simple proposition was to sort of steal the film out from under me, and in return for nothing. Because
look, this is the same Steve Bannon who pled guilty to defrauding donors of the Build the Wall nonprofit out of $15 million. It had nothing whatsoever to do with Trump. His two co-conspirators served long prison sentence. The president pardoned Bannon, but then when he was re-indicted in New York State on the exact same charge, in the same court which had treated Trump so badly, Bannon pled guilty to the embezzlement, to the fraud, $15 million, but was given no jail time. Then Bannon would turn around and be named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the $1 billion fraud trial of his, I would call, shady Chinese patron, who was convicted of various financial crimes, but Steve himself, again, not prosecuted. Now there seem to be legitimate questions about a lawsuit pertaining to Bannon's management of a Bitcoin company. But it's the emails that I find shocking. Here's a man who goes on the air on the War Room, a show title he stole from Owen Schroyer and me over InfoWars, where he continues to support President Trump, yet he's calling Trump stupid, calls for Trump's removal under the 25th Amendment, brags about undermining Trump's China trade policy, and says that he, not Trump, but he, Bannon, is the center of the MAGA movement. This is outrageous. I mean, first of all, you see him also coaching Epstein about a film that they are supposedly making, where he says he's going to bury the pedophile narrative. Now he wants us to believe that he was just cozying up to this monster, when it's very clear that his coaching of him is to rehabilitate him after he had already been convicted of a sex crime in Florida.
I mean, this is so bizarre and sinister and interesting, I think, Roger, because let's start with the fact that in public, as you said, Bannon is pro-Trump, right? In fact, Bannon wants Trump to run even for a third term. So it would sound like Bannon is Trump's biggest supporter. But then when you read the private communications with Epstein, the opposite picture emerges, that Bannon even has resentment toward Trump, because he thinks that he, Steve Bannon, is MAGA, not Trump, but Bannon. He says this explicitly. And Bannon also is not above conspiring to want Trump to be ejected from office under the 25th Amendment. I mean, it's just outrageous stuff. And now Bannon is trying to cover all that up by saying, as, you know, I'm doing research. I had to ingratiate myself with Epstein because I wanted to get the scoop to make a really powerful, critical documentary, except that when you read these communications and they go on and on and on, they're not research. In fact, it's quite clear that it's essentially, I kind of put this in a somewhat salty way. I go, it's a little bit of you scratch my groin and I'll scratch your groin. In other words, both Epstein and Bannon are getting something out of each other, and they're working together to sort of boost each other. So Epstein is telling Bannon, hey, Bannon, listen, you don't want to be like a political hack, so you need to go into media. That's a kind of a better front for you. You can continue your activities under the sort of banner of I'm a journalist. And sure enough, soon after that, Bannon surfaces in War Room. And conversely, you have Bannon advising Epstein, basically telling Epstein, this is a way in which you can, by and large, burnish or polish up your image. And so this has nothing to do with research, and people who fall for that, I think, are showing a level of gullibility. I mean, I realize that with so many of these guys, it is a little hard to believe that they are so different in reality from the public image they project. But that's what the facts clearly show, and they show it very vividly and gruesomely in this case.
Yeah, I find it interesting. Bannon started attacking Elon Musk when Musk began calling for full disclosure regarding Jeffrey Epstein. Bannon claimed that Elon was not a legitimate U.S. citizen, that's nonsense, and then demanded that Musk be stripped of all of his federal government contracts for SpaceX and Starlink. Elon Musk, in my opinion, has probably done more for the First Amendment and free speech in this country than anyone other than the founding fathers. But Bannon relentlessly attacks a man who spent millions of his own money to help Donald Trump score the greatest single comeback in American history, because he saw, when he purchased Twitter, he saw the files that showed government manipulation of free speech, the cancellation and the censorship of people like you and I, Dinesh. But the supporters of Steve Bannon say, Well, he went to prison for 3 years because of his support for Trump. But the truth is, when you get a congressional subpoena, he could have simply fulfilled his legal obligation by showing up for the hearings and asserting his Fifth Amendment rights for the January 6th committee. That's what I did. That's what General Flynn did. Not because I had anything to hide, not because I particularly knew anything, but because I have extensive experience with the Democrats' ability to take honest testimony and twist it into a process crime. But for some reason, Bannon decided to be a martyr. I can't believe that he had lawyering that bad. You can't thumb your nose at a House subpoena, and he should have known better. Instead, he uses it to validate himself. But look, we now know from email today that not only did he want to make Mike Pompeo president, the ultimate globalist, a man who was informed of the Russian collusion hoax and could have warned Donald Trump, as the declassified documents put forward valiantly by Tulsi Gabbard prove, but did not do so. So this idea of Steve Bannon as the ultimate Trump loyalist is an absurdity. And then they only released 2 hours of 15 hours of video. I'd like to see the rest of that video, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let me comment on a couple of things that you said, because I think it's possible that, strange though this seems, that Bannon had a certain type of incarceration envy. And by that I mean Bannon realized that the way to really boost his reputation in the MAGA crowd is to sort of get himself locked up. I mean, this would explain why. I mean, maybe his lawyer told him, hey, listen, all you have to do is go in there and plead the Fifth, and this way you'll be fine. But Bannon instead is like, no, I'm not going to do that. I want them to come get me. I want them to lock me up. This, I think, would make sense of Bannon's behavior in that strange situation. The Elon Musk thing, to me, is also interesting because, again, Bannon gave the idea that his opposition to Elon Musk is because, he's a sweaty working-class guy standing with, the plumbers and the carpenters and the dock workers against the kind of high-tech, effete elite coming out of San Francisco. So Bannon made it sound like an ideological posture. But what you're saying, Roger, is that no, the real reason for his hostility to Musk is that Musk was actually familiar with the content of the Epstein files and recognized that Bannon is like, he's one of the most dominant figures in those files.
No, he two interesting things. One, thanks to Mario Nawfal, who first online influencer and voice who noticed this, but very clearly Epstein himself books Steve Bannon a flight to the U.S. Virgin Islands and notes in an email to his staff that Steve is staying with me. We still don't know whether Bannon was in fact on the island himself. The New York Post places him in Epstein's apartment. They had breakfast at least 18 times, according to these emails. And in the emails, Bannon refers to him as a god, also refers to him as brother. Epstein offers Bannon the use of his palatial home in Palm Beach or his Tony St. James Island, suggesting that Bannon might want to take a lady friend there. And Bannon says, "Thank you, brother." Who calls a convicted sex criminal brother? I think the whole thing has to do with money. I think that as they talk about it, he talks about how the format for whatever filming they're doing together. But I think this was really about money. We know that Epstein tried to contact Bannon when he was working in the Trump White House. Bannon did not respond to him. He only showed up at the largest residential home in Manhattan where Epstein lived in 2018 after he had already been dismissed. I think there's a lot more to this story because it's the next phase of Steve's career in which he is financed by a Chinese national named Miles Guo, who was later convicted in a $1 billion fraud schemes. Bannon is an unindicted co-conspirator in that matter, but was not charged with any crimes. Yet Guo refused 55 times he asserted his Fifth Amendment when asked if his money came from the CCP and about the role of a mysterious William G., who was a Communist Party functionary who was involved with both Guo and Bannon. That story's still developing. So he kind of moved on to his next gig, but now Steve thinks that he will be a viable candidate for president when he doesn't want to answer questions about this Epstein stuff, and when his, I think, paid influencers are out there saying, oh, it was all about the film. That just doesn't cut it for me.
Well, I think if Bannon runs for president, we would have to see it as a money-making scheme and not any sort of genuine campaign. One interesting, for me, window into the whole situation, there's no indication to me that Bannon is any kind of a sort of sexual pervert. There's nothing about girls or underage girls in the correspondence, at least that I have seen. And yet here's Bannon hanging out with not only Epstein, but evidently Epstein's buddy, Woody Allen. And then, of course, my mind flashes back a couple of decades where Woody Allen begins this tempestuous affair, with Mia Farrow's daughter, and the whole thing is extremely sordid. And so Bannon is clearly knowledgeable about the depth of perversion of this world that he's moving in, and yet he moves in it not only effortlessly, but as you say, he seems to admire these figures and hold them up to be some kind of exemplar.
All right, we're going to take a break there. We'll be back with Dinesh D'Souza. Just a minute.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Dinesh, when Steve Bannon showed up as a surprise witness in my Washington, D.C. trial against me, the prosecutors had a legal obligation to inform my defense attorneys that Bannon himself was under investigation for defrauding donors to the Build the Wall Foundation out of $15 million. Of course, they never did that. That's why I don't find his proposal to you that you raise the money, you put your blood, sweat, toil, and creativity into a documentary that you would then turn over and let him have for nothing so that he could market it and make millions of dollars is really surprisingly not surprising.
Well, yeah, I think he's obviously a wheeler dealer, and the people who have dealt with him know that. But the Epstein thing is at a whole different level, right? Because ambition, wheeling, dealing, even a certain degree of amorality, you've been around long enough in Washington to know that's a very common commodity. I think what we are owed here from Bannon, and this is really going to be the test for him, is some kind of an honest public accounting. Now, he hasn't done anything like this yet. He's essentially gone into a sort of hiding. He's put out this statement that he's doing research. So he's in a major kind of cover-up and denial mode, hoping it'll go away mode. But I think that what he really needs to do is a kind of honest examination of conscience and an honest kind of public acknowledgement of where he went wrong, what he was trying to do. I don't know if we're going to get that from him. I suspect we are not. But don't you think, Roger, that's what he needs to do?
I think it exempts him for any leadership in this movement. Not only is he not the centerpiece of the movement as he sees himself, but I don't think he's influential. I remember when he scheduled a series of nationwide rallies before the 2022 elections with himself as a major speaker, and literally, as reported in the media at the time, nobody showed up. So I think he's a legend in his own mind. He says he understands he won't win the nomination, but he wants to have an impact on the process. I think he's exempted for leadership. Someone who is helping rehabilitate a sexual pedophile who was very clearly coaching him on that. Someone who denigrates the President of the United States as stupid, advocates his removal under the 25th Amendment, brags about working against his his Chinese trade policy, and someone who I think gets money from admittedly questionable sources to pay this little army of influencers, his posse, that either today are silent in the face of these emails or are attacking those who are asking legitimate questions. So at the end of the day, I think he has exempted himself. God, in my case, the Bible tells me to forgive, and I have done that. As difficult as that is, because this was an unnecessary act of treachery, but that doesn't mean forget, and I haven't forgotten what he did. Only the New York Post reported it at the time, but all the way back in 2018, I went on InfoWars. I am happy to say my name is in the Epstein files. Specifically, Epstein complained to Bannon about an interview I gave on InfoWars, where I correctly connected Jeffrey Epstein to the Clintons as the early financier of the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative, and the fact that Bill had been on the island, I believe, at least 7 times, and been on the plane 27 times. The 7 I base on the sworn testimony of 3 of the Epstein victims. Be sure to check our guest's new show. It is simply called Dinesh, his new weekly show. You can see it on virtually every platform. Dinesh D'Souza, thanks for joining us today in The Roger Stone Show.
Roger, it's always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Roger Stone Show. You can hear The Roger Stone Show Sunday afternoons at 3. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode so you never have to wonder.
What the heck is going on here?
Rural Americans deserve access to the best of what our country has to offer, especially health care. Across every state, every community, America's rural hospitals are the first line of defense, protecting our families, neighbors, and loved ones. No matter where you live, hospital care doesn't clock out. They're there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Each year, America's over 5,000 hospitals care for millions of patients, providing 24/7 emergency care, delivering babies, cancer treatments, and other life-saving care that patients rely on. Behind every one of those patients are doctors, nurses, and caregivers working tirelessly to keep people healthy and safe. Hospitals are our community's lifelines. They employ our neighbors and keep our families healthy. But now, some in Congress are threatening access to care. Tell Congress, protect patient care to keep America strong. Don't cut rural health care.